So we've done recruitment. This time we're now turning our attention to retention. Obviously a lot of work to be done there too, at least as important as recruitment, I would say. It's basically going to be the same as before. Coloured tables at the front. I'll get my facilitators to give their pitch in a minute, and then we'll get into some discussion. And then, again, we'll capture the feedback, and we'll go from there. So, right, who am I going to invite first? I'm going to invite Rachel Berridge, who is Learning and Development Trainer, Clinical Education at Nuffield Health, to do our first.
Morning everybody, it's lovely to be here, lovely to see so many faces. So I'm going to be looking at preparing newly qualified nurses to become leaders. I do feel that sometimes when the word leader is mentioned, it's always sort of thought about as a senior sort of person, but I really want to change that narrative and get more newly qualified nurses to see themselves as leaders. So the questions I'm going to be looking at today is thinking back to when you were all newly qualified. Did you see yourself as a leader and why? What can we implement through preceptorship to ensure our nurses see themselves as leaders? And what impact does involving newly qualified nurses in quality assurance activity through preceptorship have on their development? Thank you.
Fantastic. You were so succinct, you caught me writing notes there. So, no, it was really good, really good. Right, so next up, Dr. Kerry Jones, please.
Okay, so in the blue corner, we are going to consider two things. The first is, we know we've got key points of vulnerability, don't we, in terms of retention. And one of those key points of vulnerability is in the first 2 years after registration. And we know that transition period is key. However, what we also know is if we retain a nurse for more than 2 years, they're likely to stay in the workplace or in the workforce for the next 10. So that's a considerable value proposition, isn't it? And so the first question we'll consider is, how do we engage everybody in an organisation and system in the big picture? So whether you're a peer or whether you're the executive officer in an organisation, how do you engage people, or have you engaged people in that big picture? And the value of front-loading support and resources for preceptorship. The second thing we're going to discuss is, we know there's no single elegant solution in terms of retention. We know it's a bundle of interventions, and we know that the evidence on that is pretty consistent and can be found in the recently published National Retention Guide for Nursing and Midwifery. But also we know that the needs of people in terms of supporting them to transition successfully and to stay will be nuanced in terms of individual, but also context they're working in. So the second question is, what have you done to diagnose what's important to your nurses and midwives? And how have you used that to develop interventions that have embedded to deliver transformational change? Because what we know is this isn't a tick box. If you think you can tick a list of policies and procedures and that will deliver retention gains, we know that doesn't happen. It's this whole bundle and it's the evidence base. So if you haven't done anything, come to the blue table and suggest things you think we might do. So if you're a little bit of a person that wants to rock the boat and you're absolutely desperate for transformational change, come to the blue section.
Great, thank you, Kerry. Just to point out that Kerry is the Director for Nursing and Midwifery Education and Transformation at Coventry University and Coventry and Warwickshire ICS, which I forgot to mention. Right, next up is Professor Gemma Stacey, Deputy Chief Executive Officer and Director of the Policy Unit at the Florence Nightingale Foundation.
Thanks, Steve, and hi, everybody. So our table, which is the yellow table, is going to be building on the results of a survey that the Florence Nightingale Foundation undertook in partnership with the Nursing Times and also Unison. And just very briefly to give you the highlights of what we found around that survey, was that 84% of the established workforce felt that the transition from student to newly registered nurse was more challenging than ever. And we actually got responses from 5,000, which I believe is the highest response rate the Nursing Times have ever had to a survey. So there's clear commitment and passion for this agenda. But also 85% of those that responded felt that preceptorship was vitally important in supporting that transition. But unfortunately, 45% believed that there wasn't the willingness or capacity within the workforce to invest in that preceptorship. Through the qualitative comments we gathered from our students and early career nurses, there was a sense that people felt they were being left to sink or swim, and that preceptorships needed to shift in their focus from something that was about retesting their competency to something that was about creating belonging within the organisation, feeling valued, and also identifying and celebrating their individual contribution. They were also particularly interested in forums like clinical supervision for that thinking and reflective space. So at the Yellow Table, we'll be asking you to reflect on these findings, to share with us actions that you feel needs to be taken or are already being taken to address these things. And we have what I call the miracle question. And those mental health nurses in the room might recognise this one. So, suppose that while you are sleeping tonight and the entire house is quiet, a miracle happens. The miracle is that the problem that you have brought has been solved. However, because you were sleeping, you did not know that miracle had happened. So when you wake up tomorrow morning, what will be different that will tell you that that miracle has happened and the problem that you brought today here is solved? Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you, Gemma. And next up is Louise Berwick, who is the Training Hub Director, Primary Care Workforce and Training Hub, Primary Care Doncaster Limited.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm here banging the drum for primary care nursing and the importance of newly qualified or new to practice nurses landing well in general practice. It's often said that if primary care fails, the NHS fails. And practice nurses are the linchpin of primary care, the primary care workforce. So this is absolutely critical. We've got to retain them, we've got to recruit them, we've got to look after them. So we'd really love you to join us on the purple table, and I've dressed appropriately in purple, especially for that, to talk about these issues. So to talk about why primary care is a special case. We're often called a special case. But why are we a special case when it comes to preceptorship? What's different about it? Why do we need to have a different approach, or do we? How can good nurse preceptorship in primary care positively affect the rest of the primary care workforce, the rest of the team? And how do we ensure that primary care nursing preceptorship is valued equally in our ICB and our ICSs, as the numbers are much smaller? So please come and join us. Even if you're not from primary care, come and have a conversation with us to look at that. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Louise. And last but not least, we've got Winnie George, who's the National Programme Lead for Attention at NHS England.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here, to be talking about a subject very close to my heart. I've met colleagues that I've worked with in preceptorship over the last 9 years. So on the green tables, we're going to be talking about retention through preceptorship, but our focus is going to be on how we're supporting preceptors. So we've got 3 questions. The first question is, what support or development do you have for preceptors in your organizations or systems? So we do recognize that now we have system working, so it's really, really important for us to not just think about our organizations, but what preceptorship looks like within systems as well. There's a second part to this question. Would you like to share any challenges or successes in implementing your preceptor support or development? Because we know we do have some challenges. And I know nationally we have amazing preceptorship programs for preceptees, but the area that we all need to really work on is preceptors. It's really, really important that we continue developing preceptors. The second question is, how have you demonstrated that the role of the preceptor is valued and appreciated within your organizational system? And the last question is, if you had all the funding you needed to develop the most amazing preceptor development program or package, what would that look like? So we need to dream big. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you in the green table.
Great, thank you, Winnie. There you go. You've heard what we're going to talk about and our pitches. So if you can now move to the colour table and get ready to talk to our facilitators. So blue is over there, purple in the front, yellow, green and red. Thank you. We can bring it down a little bit and then I'll invite our first speaker back to the lectern. So that is in fact Rachel. So Rachel, do you want to come and give some feedback?
Right, thank you so much to the red tables. It was really, really interesting to hear all of your ideas. I have jotted down some. I will apologise, I can't get through everybody's because there was so much going on. So I do apologise if I don't get to your point. So just as a reminder, we were looking at preparing newly qualified nurses to become leaders. And the first question was to think back to when they were newly qualified and did they see themselves as a leader and why not? And we had a really mixed bag, to be honest. So there was a few people who said yes, they did, and that was as a result of their role models when they were a student nurse, who they could look up to as a really inspirational leader and who they wanted to become like. And also programs post-qualification to help them see themselves as a leader. But then we also had some people who said from the outset they didn't see themselves as a clinical leader. A lot of that was down to the lack of culture of seeing those newly qualified nurses as a leader and almost being told, actually, no, you're not a leader, you're just kind of here to do a task, which I'm hoping we're going to kind of move away from. Others said it was lack of exposure to positive leadership, the freedom to speak up when something isn't quite right. Often they felt that they weren't able to do that. Some said they felt very dependent on others, they weren't able to make their own sort of decisions. And we also identified it really depends on how leadership is defined and how you see leadership, what leadership means to you. And finally, looking at nature versus nurture. So are you born a natural leader or do you develop leadership skills through your experiences? So the second question we looked at was what can we implement in preceptorship to ensure that our newly qualified nurses do see themselves as leaders? And it was really interesting hearing everyone's ideas. So one of them was a pre-preceptorship period, so working a lot with third-year student nurses to prepare them for being newly qualified and kind of setting the bar as to what is expected of them when they qualify. Shadowing others in leadership roles, whether that's newly qualified nurses spending time with matrons or people in quality assurance, and getting that role appreciation, so understanding actually what leadership is within clinical practice. Having role models that they can identify with, so somebody who is similar to them from a similar background, not just all of one kind of identity, someone that they can identify with, and having shared decision making and understanding why they're making certain decisions. Giving them responsibility in a safe way, so not just kind of expecting them to, on day one, have all this responsibility and not actually coaching them through everything, gradually ease them into having responsibility and identifying long-term goals from the outset. And finally, what impact does involving our new nurses in quality assurance activity have on their development? There was lots of ideas around reducing friction as a result of the role appreciation, understanding what others are doing, which in turn improves staff well-being. Of course, increased patient safety is a really, really big one. Learning new skills such as negotiation skills and decision-making skills. And finally, the main point there was not just expecting newly qualified nurses to be able to be involved with quality assurance, put my teeth back in. They must be coached through it, again, in a really safe environment. So thank you to everyone on the red table who contributed.
Right, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, and thank you to the red table, and that was preparing newly qualified nurses to become leaders. Next up is Kerry, who was the blue tables, and that was practically supporting transition in the workplace.
Okay, so we had 4 packed tables, so it's probably impossible to do justice to the richness of the conversation, but just a flavour of things. And I think the first output is we need a preceptorship conference funded because there's so much to go at here and it's such an important area in terms of retention. I think the second thing was on the funding line, that actually we recognise we need to create the case for that investment. I think the second cross-cutting theme is variability, and I think we know that from previous surveys. So people were very honest and transparent about the variability in engagement and quality of preceptorship across the country. Another theme that came up was it's really important that we support and develop leaders to be able to support transition and early career. Things like their role, the coaching model, engaging them with the big picture because everyone makes a difference. The value of that investment in the busyness of the day-to-day. And also things like multidisciplinary team working and the cultural dimensions of transition, because I think the group recognise it's not just newly qualified nurses that have come through our homegrown pipeline, but our international colleagues that also require that support. And then the next big section really was, I'll call it It's the Small Things. So it's not policy and strategy, it's interface stuff. And I think, as they say on Strictly, the message is keep listening. And I think that that's really what people were saying was it's beyond the survey. Yes, surveys are great, but you need a whole plethora of ways to capture the voices of those people and their experiences, but also you need to act on what they're telling you, and that's probably something that needs honing. Suggestion was, let's stop calling it a satisfaction survey and let's call it a needs analysis, because actually it's about understanding individual and group needs so that we can meaningfully address those for improvement. Small changes, and two key things here: safe spaces to do that and getting the message that it's okay not to be okay. And I think I'm going to stop there and thank colleagues for their contribution and hope that I've done you justice.
Great, thank you, Kerry. And now we turn to the yellow tables, which was Gemma, and what changes should we implement following the learning from our survey, Nursing Times and FNF survey?
Thank you. Thanks, Steve, and thanks to everybody who chose to come to the yellow table and contribute to our discussion. First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge the context in which that survey was completed. We published it in February, the data was collected in January and December, and so that was a group of students and newly registered nurses who had to make that decision as to whether they would continue on their programmes or whether they would take the option to be paid for the equivalent of their placement hours. And we can't underestimate the challenge and the dilemmas and emotional consequences of that. Similarly, they are our first generation of nurses who have paid tuition fees. And so, again, how that affects their expectations and their thoughts around what their employment experiences should be is something else that needs further consideration. But on to our discussion. We spoke first of all around the value of the national policy frameworks for preceptorship that have been recently published. And lots of people around our tables were talking about having conducted a gap analysis to see where they are now and what they need to do in order to work towards those minimum standards, but actually to achieve those gold standards of what the very best preceptorship offering would look like. There were some absolutely wonderful examples of using innovation to release time for preceptors and preceptees to have those in-depth and meaningful conversations and to walk alongside our newly registered nurses as they make that transition. So some examples were things like clinical educators working on the wards to release the preceptors to spend that time either to do on-the-ward teaching or to reflect with the preceptees. Using the legacy mentor funding as well to enable a preceptor workforce. And also specific roles that were totally dedicated to supporting that transitioning workforce. And that's not just student nurses, it was nursing associates, international nurses, and those returning to practice as well. But one of the biggest concerns I think I heard from the tables was around in places a lack of organisational support for preceptees, and that filters down to the management level, where preceptees can sometimes be seen as a burden to the clinical environment. So permission to access the preceptorship programmes was sometimes not given. And the result of that is that the preceptee feels guilty in accessing those things, and may even themselves devalue the time as preceptees to access those support structures. But we absolutely can't underestimate the value of role models and really investing in our newly registered workforce. I heard a lovely quote from one of our members of the table that was, it's where we see that sense of I care about you, and the consequence of that is that these preceptees' confidence is through the roof and they really, really thrive. One of the suggestions was that we may have moved away from a sense of ownership for ward managers. So the kind of models of mass recruitment where people are placed in the environments where there's the biggest need and the highest vacancies means that the newly registered nurse has not selected that particular practice area, and similarly the managers have not selected them to be part of their team, and that might be a strategy for really starting that sense of ownership and belonging from the outset. So our final question, that miracle question, was what would it look like if we had this completely sussed? And I really love to hear that sense of you could walk into a clinical environment and see those dyads working together. Their conversations are animated, passionate, and there's equal dialogue and respect between the preceptor and the preceptee. That maybe we don't have the term preceptor because it gives a paternalistic kind of sense, and that person needs to be looked after. But actually those relationships are energising and rejuvenating. And we have an over-establishment of staff because we have retained our staff. So our numbers to release people for time to attend preceptorship is no longer a problem. But ultimately it's about voice and being listened to. And again, another quote from Jess's table was really around how we always talk about being time poor, but actually we are very good at making time for the things we see as important. And what we need to do is make sure that preceptorship is valued in a way that it is equally important to those other things that we prioritise, because it is so critical to the retention of and the long-term retention of our profession. Thank you, Yellow Table.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gemma. And now we turn to primary care, and Louise, who was purple, is going to talk about preceptorship and best practice with preceptorship in primary care.
Okay, so thank you for all of those that joined us on the purple table. I think we got a few more because people thought they were blue, the tablecloth, so that was good. We don't care. So our first question was around why was primary care a special case, and did we think that was the case? Our table thought that it definitely was a special case, and partly because students don't get a lot of exposure to primary care during their training, so they don't know enough about it, but also because it's a different skill set, so we need to do something more bespoke because it's different. The actual the job itself is so different. But we did talk about how there did need to be standardisation, so if we were leaving this to individual practices, then we weren't quite sure that that would work, so it needed to be at sort of system level to make sure that what all these nurses were getting was of a standard and that helped them as a group. We also talked a little bit about the myth busting that needs to happen around people being able to come straight into primary care and not have to work in other sectors first, so how we would build that in. And then also how we would do it. So it's general practice often has not enough physical space to bring people in, to bring in people to do these programmes and to bring in student nurses. And how else could we do that? How else could we give exposure to people to primary care? So we talked a lot about sort of blended learning and different approaches across the country that are happening to give people exposure without them physically having to be there all the time. We then talked about how good nurse preceptorship can positively affect the whole rest of the team. And we thought, if we're delivering confident practitioners that come into their roles with that confidence, it will have a knock-on effect to the rest of the team. And these new nurses are bringing new ideas that can really stick. It's a new pair of eyes into your organisation, and it's helping to change the culture so that things can be done differently and often better because of it. We talked a lot about rotational schemes as well. Can we do a bit more together? Primary care, we're all sort of saying, here we are, can you help us? What can we do together with secondary care and other sectors to make sure that people get a wider experience of all different types of nursing before they then specialise in the place they want to be? And we also thought that good preceptorship for nurses also ought to be looked at in other areas. So, for example, for nurse associates, if we've got a good example of a nurse preceptorship, what can we do for other aspects of the system? And then finally, we just talked about how can we ensure that primary care nursing preceptorship is valued equally in our ICBs. And really, it was just about making sure that we'd got a voice, a place around the table within the ICB to keep shouting for primary care, to make sure that voice is heard, and to make sure there are champions there that keep putting the hand up and saying, hang on, what about primary care? How do we look at the whole patient journey, not just secondary care and primary care? How do we look at that all as one? I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Louise. And Winnie, who is green, and how are you supporting preceptors?
Hello. We had so much to talk about, so I didn't have time to even take notes. We had 4 very full green tables talking about what support is being offered for preceptors. So I'm going to try and read the flip charts as well so that I don't miss anything. But what we all agreed, the consensus was that there isn't a lot around preceptor development. And again, in terms of time for preceptors, it's really difficult for preceptors to get that time. So we know that all of us, we agreed that we need to have robust training for preceptors. So that's really important. And what's happening at the moment? What do people have? So people have got some workshops. We do have the Health Education England, the e-learning module, which is currently being revised. There are some practice education facilitators who provide support, sometimes one-to-one support, but we also recognize that in terms of precepting, there are also different models. So in some areas, you have preceptors who support all preceptees, or you have clinicians who are working in different clinical areas. For example, some registered nurses who've done some preceptor training, but again, in a lot of areas, there isn't that preceptor training. Let me just check the second flip chart if I've left anything. So for others, they've got preceptor forums, coaching, training, change programs for preceptors. And the other table, they like preceptors actually from outside the clinical area. And the example that's been put here was 3 preceptors for 30 preceptees. That's a lot. So again, it's about looking at that model of precepting. What does it look like? So in my previous role, when I worked as a preceptorship lead, on the last day of preceptorship, we did offer preceptees some preceptor development just to prepare them for that role of being a preceptor. So for the second question, we asked, how have you demonstrated that that the role of the preceptor is valued and appreciated? So some people have got awards, some people have got preceptor, conference, recognition through nomination, feedback, and others actually said, let's look at this room here. Do we have mostly managers here? Do we have preceptors? So events like this, some colleagues feel that we should have preceptors here so that they're the ones working, providing that support. They also need to access what we're accessing as well. And the last question was, if you had all the funding you needed to develop the most amazing preceptor development program package, what would it look like? So one of the things that one of the tables suggested was exec sponsorship, because a lot of us have got amazing preceptorship policies, but if that sponsorship is not coming from the top leadership, sometimes it's really, really difficult. And the other thing was to embed preceptorship, the preceptor role within the education strategy. That's really, really important. I can see I'm running out of time here. But time is an issue. Everyone agreed that that protected time that we talk about is really, really difficult. So therefore, a lot of colleagues were actually saying that preceptorship needs to be mandated so that that support can be provided. But also we need to raise the profile of the role of the preceptor is really, really important. Training is important, protected time, sufficient staff. I just want to make sure that I don't miss anything. The other thing is we've got shared professional decision council for preceptees, and others thought that it's really important to make sure that preceptors are part of that, or whether we needed to create a separate one for preceptors. So in general, we've all agreed that there's a lot of work for us to do around preceptor development. The other thing that we also discussed is there are some areas that have got amazing preceptor development, but we're not sharing. Why do we need to reinvent the wheel? So in my role as preceptorship lead, I developed an accredited preceptor module. And I asked colleagues, they didn't know about it. And it's important for us to share things like that and to make sure that, we provide that support. But if I'm developing something and I'm keeping it in my own organization, it's not helpful for others. And again, we've created a lot of networks, so we're all going to be linking up to make sure that we continue that sharing. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you again to our facilitators. So Winnie, Louise, Rachel, Kerry, and Gemma. Thank you. And thanks again for all your hard work and engagement. It's now lunchtime, you'll be pleased to know. So we've got an hour. So back here around 22:02, I think it is. So please go and enjoy lunch. Thank you.